So the discussion becomes then, when is Laylatul Qadr? Multiple opinions, as you can imagine. There's one opinion from Ikramah, where he said it was the 15th of Sha'ban. And this is of course wrong, because Allah Azza wa Jalla said شهر رمضان الذي أنزل فيه القرآن, right? And إنا أنزلناه في ليلة القدر. So it has to be in Ramadan. You have the opinion of Imam bin Hazm rahimahullah ta'ala, who mentions it in the beginning of the first 10, so the 20th or the 21st. You have the opinion of Abu Sa'id al-Khudri and Ibn Abbas radiyallahu anhuma, the early opinion that mentions it as the 23rd night of Ramadan. You have an opinion of Ibn Umar radiyallahu anhuma, that's the 24th or the 25th night of Ramadan. And then you have the opinion of Ubay ibn Ka'ab, the later opinion of Ibn Abbas, and many other scholars who say that it's the 27th night of Ramadan. And they have their evidences for that. And then you have other scholars who say that every year it changes to a different night, with it being more likely in the odd nights. Again, we have an article that goes through all of these opinions and how they were justified. And Imam an-Nawawi rahimahullah ta'ala, he mentions in his commentary of the hadith of Sahih Muslim that this is the best way to harmonize the hadith, is that it can change from year to year. That it could be on the 23rd one year, and then it could be on the 25th the next year, it could be the 27th the year after that. So it moves within the last 10 nights of Ramadan. That is the opinion of a great majority, or not a great majority, but of many of the scholars of Islam. And it's the one that allows us to strive most throughout the last 10 nights. There's a weak narration that if an odd night coincides with Laylatul Jum'ah, and I mention this because we hear it every year, with the night of Friday, which would technically be Thursday night, then that's more likely to be Laylatul Qadr. Imam bin Rajab rahimahullah mentions this in Lata'if al-Ma'arif, but there isn't a solid proof of this. So could it be that because the night of Friday, which is a blessed night, if it coincides with an odd night of Ramadan, that it's that? Allahu A'lam. It could indeed be that there's a greater likelihood, but still, are you going to miss out on the other nights as a result of it? Imam al-Razi rahimahullah ta'ala, he says that Allah did not tell you when Laylatul Qadr is, or it was not conveyed to us through the Prophet ﷺ, because he didn't want people to fall into sin. Because if you knew what exact night it was and you missed it, then think about how sinful you would be. Like if you knew it was one night of the year and you still didn't worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on that night, then think about how sinful you would be. Now there is this narration where Abu Salama radiyallahu ta'ala anhu says that انطلقت إلى أبي سعيد الخدري radiyallahu ta'ala anhu. I went to Abu Sa'id radiyallahu ta'ala anhu and I said, will you not go out and take a walk with us in the garden so that we can talk to you? So he came out and I asked him, what have you heard from the Prophet ﷺ about Laylatul Qadr? And he said that the Prophet ﷺ made i'tikaf for the first 10 nights of Ramadan. This is really interesting. And then Jibreel alayhi salam came to the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam, and he said to the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam, "Inna ladhi tatlubu amamak," that which you are seeking is still ahead of you. So the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam stood up on the 10th, and he said sallallahu alayhi wasallam that Jibreel alayhi salam came to me and he told me that which is or sought is still ahead of you. So we stayed with the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam for another 10. And then on the 20th, Jibreel alayhi salam came to the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam, and he said to him again, Inna ladhi tatlubu amamak, that verily that which you seek is still ahead of you. So the Prophet ﷺ mentioned that on the 20th of Ramadan. He said, Man kana i'takafa ma'a nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam falyarji', whoever was doing i'tikaf with the Prophet ﷺ, come back to the masjid. And he says, فَإِنِّي أُرِيتُ Laylatul Qadr. He said, I saw Laylatul Qadr, وَإِنِّي نُسِيتُهَا. I was caused to forget the exact night. And he said sallallahu alaihi wasallam that it is fil ashr al-awakhir, it is from the last 10. And he said wa fi witrin, and it is one of the odd of the last 10. And he said sallallahu alaihi wasallam wa inni ra'aytu ka'anni asjudu fi teen wa ma. I see myself as if I'm making sujood in mud and in water. So basically that whatever that night's going to be in the last 10, I saw a vision of what it looks like, a dream, that I'm making sujood in mud and in water. And it was that year that on the 23rd night, there was rain, and it was a beautiful rain. And subhanAllah, there was no trace, Abu Sa'id radiallahu anhu says, there was no trace of clouds in the sky. And then suddenly, a cloud came right over us. And I remember this, subhanAllah, in 2019, in Hajj, that year in Arafah. It was so hot, and then suddenly, like, this cloud just came right over Arafah, and started to rain over us. So he said, suddenly a cloud came out, and it rained over us. and the prayer was established, and the Prophet ﷺ prostrated in mud and water, and you could see it on his nose and his forehead, and that was the 23rd night. And there are other Sahaba that also document the same incident, such as Abdullah ibn Unais in a narration in Sahih Muslim. So, last 10 odd nights. Side note, the scholars say Surah Al-Qadr has 5 ayat, and Laylatul Qadr therefore is on 5 possible nights. So it's on an odd night of the 5 odd nights, according to some scholars who looked at it in that way. In another narration from Ibn Abbas radiallahu ta'ala anhuma, the Prophet ﷺ said, "Iltamisuha fil ashr al-awakhir," that seek it in the last 10 nights. But the Prophet ﷺ said that it is fi tasi'atin tabqa. It is in the it is when 9 nights remain, or when 7 nights remain, or when 5 nights remain. Some of the scholars took this, very interestingly. They said, therefore, the odd nights would not really be known until the end of the month. Because if you're looking backwards, right, when 9 nights remain of Ramadan, or 7 nights remain of Ramadan, or 5 nights remain of Ramadan, you're not really going to know that until Ramadan is over, right? So they said that there's actually something very interesting. You'd have to look at the hadith backwards in this regard. Of course, that's a minor opinion because the Prophet ﷺ is teaching us to seek, and so therefore you're looking from this way, but it gives some greater perspective to really pay attention to the even nights, because the even nights might in fact be odd. There's also the narration from Aisha radiallahu ta'ala anha where she mentioned, Ya Rasulullah, if I see that it's Laylatul Qadr, if I'm in a night that's Laylatul Qadr, what dua should I make? And the Prophet ﷺ taught her to make a dua for the entire last 10 nights, and surely if the Prophet ﷺ knew which night it was, he would have told her, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. In another narration, the Prophet ﷺ mentioned that he had the night, but he was made to forget it when he saw the companions arguing, that it was lifted from him, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And so you think about moon fighting, and you think about the arguments that happen in the masajid, and all of these other things. SubhanAllah, an argument caused it to be lost. In any case, it was taken from the Prophet ﷺ in terms of the exact day. And the Prophet ﷺ would worship for all of the last 10, including the even nights. Some of the scholars also mentioned that one of the wisdoms of praying the even nights as well is al-ihtiyat, that it could be in case of naqs al-hilal, in case of the moon sighting having been wrong. And subhanAllah, especially in these days where you have so many different methods and sometimes you have chaos in the determination of the beginning of Ramadan, are you sure that your odd night is actually an odd night, right? And I think for most of us, we would say that it's probably not a good idea to take that type of a risk. Now, is there any wisdom, or is there anything to point to specifying it later on? Ibn Umar radiallahu anhuma mentions that some of the companions of the Prophet ﷺ, they saw a dream of Laylatul Qadr in the last week of Ramadan. In the last week of Ramadan. And the Prophet ﷺ said, I see that your dreams agree regarding the last week. So whoever wants to seek Laylatul Qadr, then seek it in the last week, which means look for it in the last 7 nights. Now, was he talking about that year, or was he talking about in general, sallallahu alaihi wasallam? There's also the narration, Abu al-Khair says that As-Sanabihi asked me, when did you migrate? And Abu al-Khair said, we went out from Yemen as migrants and we arrived in Al-Juhfa. And then there came a rider whom I asked about the news, and the rider said, we buried the Prophet ﷺ 5 days ago. I asked As-Sanabihi, did you hear anything about Laylatul Qadr? He said, Bilal, the mu'adhin of the Prophet ﷺ, informed me that it is one of the 7 nights of the last 10 of Ramadan. And that hadith is in Al-Bukhari.